So good morning. Gabe and I are here today. I believe Jeff will be coming. Jana may come. But we got started this morning talking about a walk we have every week, and a new participant starting to listen to these ideas and thoughts I met at a meeting this past week that I spoke at, who obviously was having some experience about an awareness that was new, and his thinking was somewhat unmasked. And Gabe was mentioning how you can almost read people. I think this is what you were saying, Gabe. Almost
Yeah,
read people as new to the conversation, because it sort of unmasks a lot of the hyperactivity of the thinking beneath the surface.
yeah. For me, only being getting closer to 6 years in the program is, and I was as new as any newcomer, that you can hear the pressured speech, the storytelling, the rationalization, the excuses for this and that, and it all sort of is quite clear when you're been doing this for a little while between us, Jack, that you can kind of see people coming in at really the place, I guess all of us were, that there's a there's a sort of rattling or a shaking up of the you like to call it the Etch-a-Sketch, Jack, but like they're learning to drive still a new car, and
Yeah.
it's quite clear. It's clearer to me now. Of course, even a few years ago, it wasn't so clear, but even after years of sobriety, it's not as clear. So for me, sometimes quickly and sometimes slowly seems to be sometimes slowly.
Well, and I think the real central point here is to see that if we're observing it, we're probably still doing it too.
Yeah, it's true.
And that there's elements of what we're noticing that we're happy to see someone else do, because we're not that happy to be doing them. Right?
Yeah.
It's some of those elements that may be the things we think we're not doing, because the idea of doing it is just so abysmal and so heartbreaking to the ideas we have about ourselves, that are all superimpositions of different versions of stories we tell that aren't actually real. They're just ideas we have, conversions of reality in terms of how we think of reality. And it sort of pops that bubble. But to see it, Mark said it the other day too. Mark, when we were walking yesterday, he was talking about the perspective he's starting to have on the viewpoint. He's starting to watch what he's doing, and he's starting to see that objectivity, which clearly obsessive thinking doesn't have any objectivity, because it's completely subjective ideas of the subject, having those ideas, thinking those ideas are true, maintaining those ideas, and then only seeing and hearing in the world those things it interprets as being said and seen, rather than what's actually happened. So that it creates this isolation of a bubble, per se, which feels very lonely and very disconnected, and very naturally so. It's actually good news that we have that sensation to experience how we're thinking in our feelings, so that our feelings can give us a perspective that we've obviously often lost within the thinking. But it also shows how the relative world is filled with what seem to be opposites, cause and effect, up and down, back and forth. And so if I think of thinking as something exclusive, or I think of feeling as exclusive, I'm missing the fact that they're intimately connected. And so too is everything else. So in our relative experience, if we're able to consider the absolute is absolutely always happening, then simple things like the fact that we're always present, that everything's always happening as it's happening, like right now, it's all everything that's happening anywhere is always happening right now, always. That stability in thinking starts to become natural, and the objectivity, the perspective we get, begins to include both sides that we used to think fighting for one or the other was our job and our duty and our responsibility. So the opposites become the same. They're, opposites attract within the physical realm. And the further they get apart, the stronger and more stress is created to pull them back together, because they've never been apart. We're just stretching the bounds, like time and space bends and moves with matter.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about something that connects to what you just talked about, the bubble a little bit, is we mentioned it at the end of our walk yesterday, is that some people, maybe even newcomers, and newcomers to this line of thinking that we're talking about, thinking of thinking. And so is this that you pull yourself away, that you don't go around gambling, sex, drugs, whatever, that you put yourself away from those things and thus declare you're sober and in the program, that
Right.
you're you're walking the walk, but you're hiding in a closet.
Still fretting the fret.
Yeah.
Well, my sense is, if I have any sense at all, and I seem to be sensitive enough to have some and not always express it well or thoroughly, but in looking at that, we have a great capacity as humans to act as though everything's fine when all we're focused on are the things that we want to focus on, and ignore the other things that are happening that aren't so fine in our estimation. And the ability we have to do that is like planting landmines to protect against the enemy and then forgetting where you put them and wondering why you're nervous walking in your own front yard. You know, these things are time bombs that are ticking in terms of our anticipation of somehow hiding from them and avoiding them. My history was that I came into AA and I would get 30 days. I would tell everybody why I didn't belong. I almost never raised my hand as a newcomer. I always sat in the back. I explained why I shouldn't be there. I got 30 days and thought, clearly this means I don't have a problem. If I can get 30 days. But those 30 days were long, dry 30 days that I was just trying to eke out as an excuse to claim I didn't need to be there so I could go out. So I would go out and then I'd get my ass kicked and come back in and get 60 days, and kept thinking that those thresholds would amount to something sufficient to finally satisfy the misunderstanding I had about the problem I had, thinking that somehow time was the solution, getting a little more time, a little more time. But I used to see people with the year and I think, wow, that's hard to imagine not really saying something's going on here that's pretty spectacular. And I knew it. I listened to people and I got as much as 11 and a half months under the guise of that old thinking. And I went out at 11 and a half months because it was 11 and a half dry months trying to get that year to claim that I could go out. So I didn't get it because I knew better than to think that would be, I just knew in my soul that a year would be too much to dismiss. And I used to look at people with 30 years and think, man, they must really understand life, because I could hear the buoyancy of their conversation and the joviality and the freedom that a lot of them had from the drink. They didn't suffer in the way that I felt when I stopped drinking. They didn't have that kind of constant grind daily, like you were just describing. But as I got sober finally and was completely freed of the obsession, I never had a thought about drinking or smoking pot. And when I did, I had the absolute clarity to know exactly where it would take me, and saw that what I had really recovered was choice, meaning I can think about it, I don't have to act on it. And that's the ultimate freedom of recovery. But
did you notice that instance that you suddenly now had choice, like that moment?
Absolutely, that day, I knew I'd get a year that day, because I never had the freedom. I never had the clarity that I had that day when I simply said, if I have this, I didn't admit that I had it. I didn't admit to my innermost self. I didn't, what I've been told is that we start with, we might have it, possibly, and then I may have it, and then I definitely have it, right? There's sort of a progression in understanding. But the first understanding was simply, if I have it, and if what they're saying is true, I'd probably be better off admitting I might have it. And I immediately knew to pick up the phone and call somebody. And I said, I need help. And I have a problem and I need help. I'd never done that in 6 years. So there was that moment of clarity, in my estimation, is an honesty about looking. When I'm looking honestly, I see exactly what it is I'm looking for in the healthy way, not in this sort of reactive, I'm looking for a new excuse, I'm looking for a new justification, I'm looking for a new rationalization, I'm looking for a new conspirator and somebody else who wants to start joining me in this idea I have that's insane. But really the freedom. But I looked at people with 30 years and thought, man, they must be the holy grail. They must be Siddhartha. They must have achieved Buddha's goal of freedom and all that stuff. And in my 29th year, I was sitting and watching TV with Katie. We were watching Billions with Damian Lewis and Paul Giacometti, who were sitting in a living room, and Paul Giacometti poured into two short glasses a little tiny bit of this beautiful amber colored liquid. And for the first, I thought, that is a really beautiful color. Look at how rich that amber is. And then I thought, why would he pour so little in a glass so large? Why use glasses so big for so little? And I realized that I had buried this thought that 30 years was the guarantee that I could go out and drink and use again. That I'd had that supposition, that I'd made that decision, that was the time. And I did it way back without even thinking about it, but I must have planted it because all of a sudden, for the first time in my experience, that started to come up. And at 30, I got to reevaluate and start to reassess. That's when the whole idea of the subconscious became something that I was actually conscious of, but I was ignoring and denying because it wouldn't serve the limited ideas I had in the present. And to include that now in my thinking actually just blew the lid off this idea that I'm not doing what I'm doing while I'm doing what I'm doing, because I know there's a very good possibility I am doing things I don't even think I'm thinking, or I'm acting on things I don't think I'm thinking, and thus doing things I feel like I'm out of control and are the only things I can do. And they tend to be compulsive, if not always. They tend to be much subtler than drinking and using, so I can justify that they're no big deal, but they're never healthy. They're never whole. They're never integrated. They're always some component of trying to justify the adrenals that are being released in my system for the excitement. That I'm looking for that excitement to confirm the adrenaline rush that I'm creating by making believe I'm manufacturing reality and I'm the creator of reality, rather than just seeing that I'm actually the victim. And I'm not really a victim. I am creating an effect that I want to avoid and I want to deny and I want to try to get over and feel better than, without noticing it's the cause of the thinking I'm doing. And to see that the thinking I'm doing includes thinking I don't think I'm thinking was the beginning of starting to unmask this idea that wherever I am, I'm always great. And I started seeing how much I see in others that are actually showing me what I am doing in my own thinking. They're giving me the same perspective that a mirror would explain to me how I look in terms of my opinion of my appearance, when I might have mud all over my face and not notice it.
So that's the same as not going to live life out of, to take it for alcohol or something, to not go out with friends to a restaurant where they might be serving alcohol and just like recluse yourself, and you're still
Well, the idea is that you know that you have a landmine buried that is suggesting that you can still do it, to be afraid of it.
Yeah, but the landmine isn't the alcohol. That's the thing.
Exactly. It's the thought.
But everybody thinks it's someone poured me a drink and slid it across the table, and therefore, like it's.
Yeah. No, that's very common. It's very common. That's why Bill says if you think you can drink with abandon, our hats are off to you. Go drink, try it, see how it's going to go. We know how it's going to go. For anybody who's actually an alcoholic or a drug addict, you know exactly how it's going to go.
Yeah,
but if they don't, what's that?
He says try it more than once.
Right. Because he knows where it's going to go. He's got confidence. So there's an insight of knowing that exceeds the bounds, and the difference between helping that person and not helping them is helping them see that the decisions they make are central to the actions they'll take. And that isn't something we can do for anybody. This whole self-diagnosis is based on the idea that the individual who's doing what they're doing is the only one that can determine honestly what they're doing and have an impact. Because if I tell them, it's going to be me that they blame when they use every other reason to go out and do what they are bound to do whenever they think it's the right thing to do, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. So the idea in the first step is, it isn't about alcohol. It's that we realize we're powerless over alcohol because we admit we're powerless over alcohol, and all of a sudden there's a sense of freedom. What we're really powerless over is the idea that we can control and enjoy it. So it tracks right back to the mentality. No voluntary action ever occurs without a thought. It's impossible. So to think that thinking isn't the essence of the first step is to miss the point of the powerless being there is no power in lies. There is no power in idea that I think is true that isn't true. There's no power in idea that I know is false that I can turn it into truth. Because if it's false, it's simply false. So I can work to make it true, and I would say that is obsessive thinking. I've committed to it. I think it's mine. I think it's my reality. I've converted in my thinking reality to only what I think. So I've had this conversion going on, which is a contrary version of reality because it's contrary to reality. It's just a supposed reality that I live with as though it's reality. And now my truth becomes imperative that other people understand, or they don't understand me because I think I now have become those thoughts. I think I'm the creator of reality. I must thus become the thoughts I have.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm struggling all the time against opposing opinions and what people think of me and how I look and appearance and all those things. And self-consciousness is defined as undue regard for appearance for a very good reason. That's exactly the premise. So that isn't consciousness at all. It's just an awareness that I'm embarrassed to be unmasked for what I know I'm doing that's wrong. If I didn't have a greater sense of knowing, I wouldn't be worried about how I appear at all. And the process of this unmasking puts all of us at greater ease in time with what people think. You're just like, okay, well, people think what they think. That's true. That's accurate. That I can live with. Doesn't mean I always like it, like we talked about yesterday. Like doesn't, like identifies the limits of my thoughts. It doesn't mean I can't have limits because anything I like or don't like is based on what I think. I may have some tendencies that are just preferential taste or whatever, but I don't tend to argue over those things. I don't get into fights over people because I like chocolate rather than vanilla. I just like chocolate. And if they don't have it, I'm not as happy as I might be when I get vanilla, but I discovered actually vanilla is really good. I always thought I liked chocolate. I never ate vanilla. And then when I started looking at this, I thought, oh, if it's an option, certainly it may be an option that I haven't even bothered to try because I've been thinking in this other way for so long. And I had vanilla and I thought, well, that's got its own amazing flavor. So it becomes easier to entertain other people's thoughts, to see what they're doing in terms of their thinking, and especially when you know that it's just thoughts. They're just thinking what they're thinking. But you can also notice the struggle, as you mentioned, when you're witnessing somebody talking the way they talk, when they're trying to justify what they're doing and what they're thinking, and you can feel that they're nervous. You can feel the anxiety and the stress and the sort of insistence that they're trying to get it across. And I certainly do that.
Yeah. It's easier to recognize for me.
You mean in others or?
After a little, yeah, in others.
Yeah.
I guess I haven't taken that hard a look at myself.
Well, keep in mind, the harder we look at that self, the more we think there's a self to look at. If it's only fantasy and we start admitting that we've just basically created this idea of self because we're capable of contemplating, thinking about our thinking is a contemplative capacity. That isn't common in the animal world or on this planet. That's what helps us stand out as a species. But if we've been using it incorrectly about reality, it would typically lead to an actual reality that would be filled with toxins and poisons and corruption and contaminants. And I would say that's a fairly good assessment of human history. We've been acting as though we're God in any way we've made believe we create reality. And that means pretty much what we've done. We've humanized God. He's a man. He's in the clouds. He's not here. He's got all the traits most of us hate to admit. He's vengeful, spiteful, hateful, contemptful, all things that we don't tend to say, you know what? I am really good at those things. I love having spite for people. I love condemning them for everything wrong they do. I love pointing it out. People don't tend to do that. They do it, but almost covertly as though they're not doing it because they know that there's some sort of suspicious angle that they're pursuing. My experience. So human history has been filled with gods that people have been fighting over, thinking God needs us to fight and kill each other over the idea that God is a man that has ideas, that if anybody doesn't have the same idea, it's exactly what I think when I think my ideas are true and real. I am very concerned what everybody else thinks about me, because I'm afraid they may unmask the fact that what I think isn't real by any contrary thought they have. I think they could be attacking me or they're invading my space. Very, very common.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, I guess.
So if we're converting, it's interesting that this conversation came out of this conversion of stories. If we are converting our experience of reality, which we're perfectly free to do, into a version of reality, which we're perfectly free to do, we're creating a story that's our version, and it's contrary to reality to the degree that we think it is reality, rather than simply a story about reality that we're making up in relation to what we've experienced and witnessed. So one of them has us feel condemned because it isn't true. The other one would be accurate. It's a story I'm telling. It's a conversion. And what is conversation but a conversion, a sharing of ideas? If we were both thinking identically, we would have nothing to say to one another. And what's interesting about that is that if we share an absolute state of being that's absolutely the same and never changes, there's really nothing to say about that. It's very difficult to talk about that in terms of words defining something that's indefinable, because it doesn't have any definition. It doesn't have any limits. It doesn't follow the track of words. It's an essence that is completely indistinguishable and indiscriminate and equitable and always present. It's a being condition that would be essential, not something that's optional, not something that we negotiate, not something that we can have more or less than. And now all of a sudden the God idea, which is just another name, again, even in the Jewish tradition, they don't use the word God because they recognize they're trying to limit something that can't be limited with sacrilegious. And I believe the words Yahweh that they describe, which may be meaning a word that doesn't define the thing it defines.
Yeah.
That may be why they came up with that, as far as I can tell from my limited reading about that. But if in fact that's what we've been struggling with, it isn't God, it isn't reality we've been struggling with, it isn't truth, it isn't life, it is the ideas we have about it that we think are true and real. And if that's the case, it identifies our mentality, where the insanity of those ideas, and I say insane because the idea that we can create our own reality at the expense of actually expressing reality would not be very helpful to the survival of any species. It would pit us against our own experience and each other's at such a fundamental level that all of our actions would be corrupt in relation to that. That fractured state of mind would be fractional ideas that are trying to be whole. No denominator, but we're trying to add more and more and more to the numerator to make it appear real by insistence and by force and by demands and by coercion. Like you see around the world, when people don't think the way the guy that runs their country is a dictator, they disappear. They don't want those voices. They don't want those thoughts. Something as simple as a thought is, they say the pen is mightier than the sword. It's actually the thought that the pen explains and describes that leads to that. And if this knowing is a knowing we all know, we know it. I can't tell you you have it. I mean, I can tell you, but my words are never going to convey that to you any more than they convey to someone they're an alcoholic when they think they're not an alcoholic. They're free to think that. We know they're free to think that. We're willing to let them and continue because we know their experience will eventually, it's going to either kill them or it's going to give them a chance to notice that they're killing their own experience and that it isn't necessary and that it isn't required and that it isn't, and it's simply an option to the thinking. So that shakiness, for some reason, I'm not on video. Do you
No,
notice
you are.
that?
I see you now.
Do you?
Yeah.
I don't see me on mine. Not that that's really imperative, but it's
You've seen
common.
enough of yourself. So.
Exactly. Seen myself through enough. So in our discussion, which is a conversation, if there's any advantages, it's noticing the differences we have do not define us. They simply define the words that we use to define the thoughts that we have. So the real conversion is starting to see that we have a communication and conversion, conversation, very much the same thing. There's a communion that we already have, which is intimate, absolute state of being, awareness and knowing that we know, and we're aware of, or we wouldn't exist. But we don't have to think we know it, and we don't have to think we're aware of it, because we're free to think what we want. And to think we become our thoughts is where self-determinism and self-will and self-abuse and everything that's based on the word self begins. That isn't really us, that's our thinking.
What if you're really getting more towards being aligned with your thoughts and your knowing awareness? Doesn't that start to come in line then?
Well, it's already aligned. We're just not thinking.
You're saying that you think you're your thoughts, but what if your thoughts are starting to be aligned with what is? And then you're saying the thoughts go away, or do they?
No, they become actual instigators of what you're going to do, which is now based on reality. So your chance to express reality means you may do things that actually create and manifest transformations of reality in our experience that everybody gets to enjoy and benefit from. Just like when people learn to fly, the basic shape of the airplane wing is the same as it was when it was originally invented. The aerodynamics was always there. We just didn't see it. Once we did, everybody used it. So it's the utility of it, the usefulness of it, as the book says, we become usefully whole. So my sense is that we don't have to think about reality for it to be real, right? So if we're thinking about if we learn about 2 + 2 and we know it's 4, we don't think a lot about how we got there after we get there, because we know it works every time. And when we apply it, it simply works. So if you apply the same thinking you're using to create the conflicts and think what you need to do is keep changing the thinking, you'll just create new conflicts, because the thinking hasn't changed on the basis of if the topical thinking that we're doing is what we think we need to solve and get all of our circumstances solved before we can finally have the peace to appreciate reality and God and love and all those things, we're again thinking that thinking is in fact interfering with all those things, when it isn't. It's just interfering with our mentality. Our mentality is insane to imagine that an absolute reality of any sort, or absolute truth, or absolute love, or absolute anything could be anything other than absolute. Mm-hmm. That's a mental issue. It's not. So to express thoughts, Bill calls it intuition, and I would say that's the right word, because intuition is defined as knowledge beyond reason. And that would mean that if I know more than I think, and I begin to express that, it's not going to take a lot of thinking, and certainly it's not going to take any obsessive thinking to begin to notice when I'm expressing it. If I'm wrong, I can adjust. I can be flexible. I can notice if it's like a puzzle. I'm starting to notice the piece doesn't fit. Maybe another piece fits here. And I know that another piece fits here because reality is reality. Truth is true. So it stops the compulsive urge, because I'm not trying to turn it into reality. I'm now relating to reality as reality and being aligned rather than maligned with it. So my mentality actually relaxes. My body, the stress, the anxiety, the depression, all that stuff starts to dissipate, because I'm not reinforcing the opposition to reality and creating the pressure that naturally builds up in my system when I think I need to prove it to survive, while in fact I'm killing myself the whole time. I start seeing things accurately. And it's kind of what happened that day, Gabe, when I got sober. All of a sudden, the steps made sense. They never made sense to me. And all of a sudden, and my sponsor said, "You know how to read?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Read the book." I said, "Oh, that's a thought." I don't know how many people had told me that. And I always thought, no. I don't want to do that. What's the solution? What's the solution? What's the solution? You have a sponsor? No. Have you done the steps? No. You understand what we're doing here? No. What's the solution? That's all I want. I want to be able to take the solution and go back out and drink. I mean, that's just nuttiness.
Yeah.
which is great in candy or ice cream, but it just, in mentality, it certainly skews the potential for functional behavior. And sanity is about function. It's about performance. Think of performance as about forms. Our ability to perform is our ability to relate to reality and have reality introduce. Our body language is telling us what's actually happening. And rather than thinking about things that feel wrong and bad as something to get over, which I do when I'm thinking obsessively, I start seeing that the information I'm getting in my body is actually telling me I'm thinking something that's wrong. And to try to get over it is to reinforce the wrong in my thinking and continue to maintain it and wonder why it seems to get worse in time. Just like the drinker going out and being told to drink, try it more than once. If we keep trying the thinking over and over and over again, and we keep finding the dismay of the conflicted mental anguish, emotional turmoil, and inner conflict, if that all remains, all we're doing is putting a new mask on the old idea. So it continues. We're the maintenance, managing it in this case, which is why unmanageability is the essence of the first step. Managing it is in fact giving it credit for having something to manage. There isn't anything there. It's just fantasy acting as reality. That's where the freedom comes in, is seeing that I've always been free. I've just been choosing. It hasn't been God condemning me. It hasn't been God's shortcomings that seem to be out to lunch when I call. He's not answering. It's my own shortcomings in relation to how I see this infinite state of being that would be the essence of our existence. It is no different than how we talk about the sun not being out because there's clouds. The sun is always out. Even when it seems to be down, we call it down. It's not really going down. We're going around. We're actually moving away from it. It appears to be going down, but what's actually happening is we're moving in the opposite direction of it. On this sphere that has been spinning for as long as any of us have been on it, and as long as any human has ever been on it, as long as any animal has ever been on it, as long as any form of life has ever been on this planet, it has been spinning and doing what it's been doing. And to the idea, Gabe, about understanding reality and all that stuff, we don't seem to understand gravity. The greatest minds in the world today call it a force, but apparently it isn't a force. They don't quite know what it is and how it is, but we know that it is. And we all rely on it when we get out of bed in the morning. We rely on it with every step we take. We don't understand it at all, nor do we think much about it, except when we trip and fall or something happens that breaks.
Mm-hmm.
We just live with
drink
it.
much.
Yeah. Or feel we can escape it. So gravity is a great metaphor for the idea that something completely invisible that we can't see, but we can see the effects, is exactly what happens to our so-called life when all we see are the effects that seem to be diminishing our character, diminishing our capacity, diminishing our functional ability, diminishing our awareness, and all of those other things. That's all coming out of thinking incorrectly, and thinking that incorrect thinking is in fact reality. Those things, those manifestations are not reality. They are effects created within the context of reality. Reality provides the possibility for us to do that because we are free to do whatever we want. And that's what love ultimately is the freedom to do whatever we want. It's not, if we were condemned to only do the right thing, that would not be free. We would be animals, which is basically how animals operate. They're interested in two things: not being eaten by another animal and eating something, generally another animal, to survive. I mean, they rest, they sleep, they procreate, they do all those things, but they're all in favor of perpetuating their species. But there's not a lot of contemplation. There's not a lot of sitting around. And the only things that I have realized may be suffering from that are domesticated animals. Because as soon as we domesticate them, they seem to have worry and stress. So
Yeah.
there again, horses, dogs, cats. I mean, they get medicine now, medication.
Yeah, we give them Prozac to dogs.
We're asking them to do things that they're really not naturally inclined to do. We're actually defying their nature. We're trying to dominate their nature the way we're trying to dominate reality and our own experience of nature. by making believe that our thoughts are reality. They're just a possibility, like everything, all circumstance is a possibility of reality. Everything that's ever been made on Earth or in space, because there have been experiments out there that have done things relative to no gravity or less gravity in that realm. Whatever has been made is just made out of existing realities. There's something that was there that has been utilized. It didn't create new reality, it just transformed existing reality. So we recreate things in shapes and sizes and colors. Generally with dimension, but some of the stuff's so small, medicine and all that kind of stuff is down to the molecular structure. It's invisible, but it's there and it happens and it works because it works. Whether it works correctly or not is not the point, but it has an effect. So the thinking, as you were saying, does not become as belabored as we think. When I started realizing this, I realized that I was really addicted to thinking that whatever I was thinking new had to come with bear that same weight, because I had so much hope and belief and faith in the fact that it would one day come true. And I thought that all those conditions were inherent to reality, when in fact they were inherent to the ideas I had about reality, and always had to do with stress, conflict, the instigate, all the assignments of things that God seems to have: the contempt, the spite, the vengefulness, the hatred, the killing, the needing mercy from God, because otherwise we're just going to be expunged. Those were all things that I thought I didn't have anything to do with, when I realized, oh no, I have been vengeful, I've been spiteful, I have been petty, I have been looking at people. And to the degree that I have been ignoring the things that I'm doing, I saw in them perfectly clearly what I thought they were doing. And I realized it never had anything to do with them. They may be doing those things, but however they're doing them is their business, not my business. And when I started seeing that, I realized they have the perfect freedom and I have the perfect freedom. And whatever the painting they were developing is their business. No story seems to be the same. And yet when we talk, we tend to look for connections that we have with one another in the thinking that we're doing, or the corrections we can make in that thinking. And as you know from this conversation, it's gotten highly reactive at times, especially when, I realized, and maybe not to my highest use, but I realized that by interrupting people in the middle of their stories, generally the stories were being told to prove that everything they were doing was fine.
Of course.
And if I interrupted them, because I got this sort of theme going on, and I said early on in the announcements we sent out, this is not a place to come to tell stories that excuse you from being where you are with what you have. Because most stories are all about, I wouldn't be where I am with what I have if it weren't for this, that, and the other. These are all the excuses I have that lead to this moment, when in fact, they're just stories we tell. They don't have anything to do with any reality. But when I noticed that coming, and I didn't seem to be able to break that spell, that sort of intoxication with this idea that we come together to retell our stories and thus reinforce the ideas we have about the stories being true, I realized that as I started to interrupt people during their stories, that reactivity just launched in volumes. So you could see the buildup of the charge that the story was claiming to be hidden and getting over, but in fact, it was reinforcing it. So the charge is growing in the background. Just like if I think the best thing I can do with a wrong thought that I think is right is to ignore it, it's going to continue to build in what I call my subconscious, where I don't think I see it, because my preoccupation with trying to maintain it doesn't allow. I start to become so obsessed with everything that isn't happening that I don't think what is happening is happening any longer. So the ideas I have that are causing the consequences seem to be invisible. And as a result, I say, well, that isn't happening. And all that's happening are my problems and my conflicts and my shortcomings and all of the deficiencies in the world and all the fiscal irresponsibilities and all the doubt and all the worry and all the things that I tend to weigh in on constantly and tell stories about to excuse to continue. I'm managing that problem. Book says, avoid the deliberate manufacture of misery. Bill recognized this was happening by choice. Wouldn't be deliberate if it were an accident or a coincidence or some confluence of evil spirits that were conducive to this. Doesn't mean that we haven't corrupted the spiritual experience by the thinking we do. And if spirits think, it may be the root of the whole thing to begin with. But the fact is that if a lie has no basis, there is no basis to that evil other than the maintenance of it. And the only evil, if you think of the word evil, it's live backwards.
That's a good one. I never knew that.
Yeah. So, and think of lived, devil, backward. So if we're opposing reality, we think we can turn it around when in fact we get turned around in our contrary thinking the conversion we've created is in fact not aversion at all, but reality, and everyone else should agree with that reality or our lives are at risk. And that's just dictatorial, authoritarian thinking. But it also proves we know what reality is, because if we think our reality is reality and think it should be everyone else's, we know that reality is an absolute state. We're admitting it in our demands of everyone else to agree with us and to go along with us and to abide by what we think, or call them toxic and somebody we don't want to be near. We're admitting our own failure, our own vulnerability, our own disconnect in thinking, not in reality.
Yeah, go into that a little more about, I guess you call it the co-conspirator, but people really try, and myself included, try to gather troops in our own thinking in agreement in reality of what we think is reality to move forward and to gain more territory and to, I guess, feel better about our stance.
It's a conspiracy. It's literally a conspiracy.
To do what, though? Conspiracy to
gain votes.
Conspiracy is defined as just more than one person acting towards a goal or to an act, but what are we trying to accomplish?
Normally, the conspiracy is not a constructive effort. Let me look at it really quick. Conspiracy. An unlawful, harmful, or evil plan formulated in secret by two or more persons. So think of that. If we're united in absolute truth and reality, that isn't a conspiracy, because there's nothing illegal about it, there's nothing unhealthy about it, and there's nothing evil about it. So the idea that I'm going to only hang out with people that think like me is the idea that I can conspire to create my own reality, and that whole attempt is evil. Why? Because it's the backward approach to living, literally, just like the word says. Backward. I mean, even in the words we use, we can look at them closely and start to watch them. They start actually like conversion. Conversion doesn't seem like it's any big deal. Something's being converted from ice to water to steam. It's conversion. It's possibility of what water can do, right? One is super hard. Mm-hmm. One is not hard at all. Same stuff, different temperatures, different realities, seemingly. They're just phases of potential that water has. If I harden my ideas, I don't think there's any other choice. If I realize they're foggy notions, all of a sudden, as I put light on them, actually look at them honestly, they evaporate. Same stuff, being thought of in different ways. So a conversion is not a problem, but when we think of our version as being the only version, there's nothing, it becomes controversial and contrary to all other versions, a fight. And what are we asked to do in AA very often? They act contrarily. Why? Because the thinking is still contrary. We got over the obsession to drink by admitting we had no power, but we haven't gotten over the obsession to think that we have power with respect to reality and truth. We're still thinking in those terms to think that God is missing and we need to seek God rather than seek why we think God is missing, and start to see that the source of that problem comes again from thinking about God in ways that is impossible if you think of it accurately, because an infinite source can't be somewhere and not everywhere. Which is why it doesn't matter how we define God. If you just think of something beyond your thoughts, second step, came to believe in a power greater than ourselves. What does that mean? If we're thinking of ourselves as what we think, we're simply saying there's something beyond the limits of our thinking. And to begin to consider that frees us. And what does it do? Return us to sanity. Why? Because it's always been that way. And it isn't even beyond the thoughts, it's also within the thoughts. We're just insanely thinking about them as limited rather than seeing them as absolute states of, they're causing an effect. That's all that they're causing. Those contrary thoughts are causing an effect. When you see it as causing an effect, you can look at the effect and say, I know what I'm doing. I'm causing this, period. You don't have to think of the thought in relation to all of the circumstances and the stories and the developed ideas you have about it. You just know by the effect, you're causing it, period. Responsibility is absolute. We wouldn't be responsible if we didn't exist. If life is responsible for all that exists, we are also responsible, absolutely. And to think in those terms begins to really disintegrate a lot of the conflicts, because as you start saying, I'm the one causing it, it starts making no sense to continue, which is really what recovery is about. It's recovering choice. And choice always allows not to be chosen. That's the whole point of choice. To think there's only one choice is to blame choice for being limited, when in fact choice always allows at least one or the other, like the binary system. You need the 0 with the 1 to make the whole computer system work. So nothing and everything are the same thing. They're connected. But we're not talking about a thing here. We're talking about something that isn't even a thing. So the words completely can't even hold up. Just like in mathematics, as they approach infinity, the numbers start to fall apart. You can't seem to get there. Why? We're already there. To see that we're here is to think in ways that math would open up channels that would be extraordinary, because we wouldn't be fighting to try to confirm something. We would simply be expressing it, since it's already confirmed in what we are doing, by simply considering it the basis of the thinking that we have is in fact that infinite knowing awareness. We're not functioning well as humans because we're thinking of our human experience as reality. We're thinking about our life as life rather than a life form experiencing the potential capacity of reality. So we diminish our capacity. We end up thinking things are scarce when they're absolutely abundant. And the potential we have to have this planet serve our interests and everyone else's is as equally great as it's always been. How we treat it and how we think of it is the only thing creating the scarcity of it that we think we have to fight for more to get, because we think it'll be taken if we don't. And where's it going to be taken to? Someone else on Earth. It's not going anywhere any more than our bodies go anywhere. They just disintegrate when we're done, but that essence of who we are remains, which is probably why they call bodies the remains. Doesn't mean we can't be sorry about that transition, because it's very nice to have people that you care about and think about and enjoy and like witnessing and touching, smelling and hearing and speaking to, seeing. So my sense is, we're not afraid of death, we're afraid of life. We're not even thinking about death correctly. We're not thinking about life correctly. How would we have any idea about death that wouldn't be corrupted by the same way we think about life?
Yeah, that's one I've been thinking about a lot is as I get older, relatives and other people start to pass, and friends, and knowing that no one gets out alive, that we're all going to end there, and everyone's afraid of literally that final breath as opposed to living now. They're so preoccupied with what is going to be something they're not going to experience actually after they're gone.
Well, and if that knowing is knowing, there is no loss of that whatsoever. And it doesn't mean that the transition of, what we have here is a fairly spectacular expression of possibility. Excuse me, a possibility of reality, right? And the fact that we have survived as a species with all of the decrepit thinking shows that our impulse is much greater than the minimization that we're attempting to prove is reality. The reduction that we're trying to prove is reality. This tiny little idea about reality rather than the expression of it all, thinking of it as something that's specific to me, that it's mine and not yours, and you have to think like I do for me to be happy and all that kind of stuff. And that whole discussion we had about like and not like gave too is interesting, because we all have likes and dislikes, and that's what leads to our choices. We all want more of something and less of something else. So it's not always about more, it's often about less. I want less aggravation and more joy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that fight for one or the other, as though it's exclusive to the other, actually creates the stress that have us realize that date of death sooner, because our bodies can't hold up under the stress because they're designed to be healthy. They're designed within a construct of reality that's sane. Reality isn't insane. Insane is a mental choice within a body that's as highly developed as anything we have on Earth. There isn't a chemical factory, a laboratory that's more sophisticated than our own physical capacity to create and produce what we need to survive. The chemical factory we have is unmatched anywhere. Same too with our brains, unmatched by any computer today. They're trying, and we are trying, because we are hell-bent literally on trying to take credit for intelligence. And I would suggest that any intelligence we think we have that's based on lies has been artificial intelligence all along. And so we're creating artificial intelligence to say, look at us, look at how brilliant we are to do such a thing. We've already got the intelligence. We're just not expressing it. We think we need to make it, commercialize it before we can take credit for it. And that goes back to the 2 weeks ago when we talked about undue credit.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
If we're fulfilled by noticing everything that's happening is happening, and we're starting to witness what we're actually doing, we're starting to take credit for what we're doing, whether we like it or not, whether we think we should be doing it or not. Just as it is, becomes a part of our concession. It's what I'm doing, period. That's giving credit where credit is due, which even means incredible or uncredible things that I'm doing that have no basis in reality. I'm starting to account for things, honestly, seeing it that way, talking about it that way. And if we have any potential to convert the masses, it would be in a conversation talking about what we all absolutely share, rather than talking about all that we each think individually about what we share, which has basically been human history. Lots and lots of religions that have Jesus at the center of them, but I wouldn't think Jesus thinks of those religions as individual. Jesus is Jesus. Jesus would think about an infinite source, a loving, forgiving, absolute source, not one that's divided by buildings and different types of crosses and outfits and all that kind of stuff. That's a human doing. Not to say we shouldn't, we're doing it. It's just what we're doing. It may not be the greatest thing we can be doing, but it's the thing we're doing. So it shows that basically this process of change that we go through, and my suspicion is that time is basically a function of change, just like dimension is a function of change.
Yeah.
To the degree that I think that thinking of mine is reality, do I think that change is inevitable and miss the fact that if everything's changing, the one thing not changing is that everything's changing? I miss the absolute nature of things when I think about them as unified, rather than as divisible according to my thoughts in relation to other thoughts, in relation to the ideas I think are real and true, in relation to other thoughts that are in collision with those ideas. So our stories are contrary versions of reality. None of them, we don't need to think about reality or describe reality for reality to be real. And to begin to realize that we don't have to conclude it at all is the ultimate freedom, because now I realize I've always had it. We all have it. Everyone has it. Everything has it. It's the basis of all of existence and life and the universe and anything beyond the universe, because if the universe is expanding, there must be something beyond it. Even that simple calculation can be done. So it would include not everything, but things that wouldn't even include things, because they're not in a spatial dimension that we think so much of as reality, because it happens to be the experience we're having with the bodies that we're experiencing it with. And in that consideration of an infinite spirit, it's not thinking of God as one God like monotheism, would suggest. That thinking of God is not, you can't count on something that doesn't function within a realm of time and space. Math and all that is designed to work within the realm of our own limited concept here. But to see that it's really not limited at all, except to the thinking we do about it and the thinking that we need to understand it before we can utilize it, rather than realize we're already utilizing it, we're just not thinking about it, is to see how thoughtlessness and ignorance can become seeming intelligence. And I would say that's the artificial intelligence that we've been promoting culturally and species-wide for a long time. It's artificial because it's made up. It isn't reality because it's a synthetic process of reality, an attempt to make believe that the thesis and the antithesis is creating something new every time, when it's just proving that the newness of the moment is always present. What does that mean? All possibility is always possible for us, always. There's nothing condemning us to do anything again, ever. And yet we tend often to think that predictability and reliability is security, when in fact it's insulating our experience and the sensational capacity we have to witness and be aware of what's happening through our sensitivity. We're really dumbing it down and numbing it down, thinking that a desensitization is actually helping, when in fact it means we're just ignoring more of what's happening, that would include the vitality of an awe-inspired experience that would be healing for everyone immediately if anyone ever got to the point of actually bothering to mention it. It would be so clear that nobody would want, that no thought could possibly withstand it, nor can thoughts withstand it right now, but to the degree we think they can. And that collective thinking is the conspiracy. We see great evil, we're all part of that evil, participating in it to the degree that we think in those terms.
Was there no great evil in the caveman days? Like, were we Neanderthals, since we didn't as increased capacity for thought as we do now? Were we not thinking or not creating such evils? And
interestingly, it seems as though when people were actually functioning more like animals, where they had no clothes, they had to eat, they had to figure out how to eat and all that stuff, they were actually dealing with real threats. The weather, imagine having not created or discovered fire. And the way apparently fire was discovered, which may not be true in all respects, but it was lightning strikes would create fires, and they could capture the fire and hold on to it that way so that they could warm it. And somebody was responsible for carrying those embers so that wherever they went, they could light a fire and be warm. Weather was a major conflict, but they were actual circumstances that they were dealing with. They weren't hallucinations. They weren't trances of anxiety over things that aren't happening. Now, was the potential there? Yes. And I would think that the potential got greater when we started to have more and more domination when we started to develop agriculture, for instance, and have a lot more than we needed to eat. It kind of took the pressure off, and it gave us the luxury of thinking more about things that weren't necessarily happening. But the inspiration quickly turned to desperation under the idea that somebody else was going to come take what we had, because now we had something to take. There was nothing for them to take when we didn't have anything. There was no threat of that thievery and all that. And the idea of sharing, maybe that reactive idea of giving up what somebody had actually earned by virtue of, like John Locke said, the person who picks the apple has the right to the apple. They've earned the apple. They picked it off the tree.
mm-hmm.
So that inherent productivity seemed to be theirs, rather than see that nature, in fact, was ours, and cooperating. Booker T. Washington traveled this country, I think I mentioned that a month or so ago, with a wagon of seeds, and just gave people seeds, so that as the sharecroppers began to plant in the freed slaves, they were actually able to develop crops that other people didn't have, so they could create value, rather than just making cotton that were already basically the plantations that already existed. Couldn't compete with those guys on any kind of broad level. But if you're growing kumquats, there were a lot of kumquat makers, and and different types of wheat and all that. And he had studied, I mean, a brilliant guy, went around in a suit and just educated people on how they could plant different seeds and get different crops and become self-sustaining. We haven't gotten to the point where everybody in the world eats. That seems to be a major flaw in our capacity as a species to claim we're the dominant species. We can't even feed the people. Not to suggest that people living in places where they can't grow anything might be a problem, but there's probably other ways to help them develop in ways that are helpful. The Salvation Army ships tons of shoes to Africa, and they've had people go over there and teach people how to repair. We throw shoes away when they're still very valuable. They teach them how to repair those shoes because shoes in Africa weren't that common. People were barefoot a lot of the time. So it limited their mobility. I mean, imagine it was probably better for them in some respect. But standing on super hot surfaces probably wasn't that helpful, and there were probably problems that were caused by that. But nevertheless, they teach people how to fix the shoes, and then they're able to sell the shoes for nominal amounts and teach other people how to fix the shoes. And so all of these shoes that go over in these bins that are 5 feet by 5 feet by 5 feet and have to be forklift onto a truck to be taken to the ships, shipped over there in containers, I imagine, end up being utilized that way, right? So the potential to actually help people. Katie's aunt in Washington used to go to Ethiopia, and they created water systems where people could get pure water and help them discover how they could actually clean the water that they were drinking that was killing them. So that education, when shared, once it works, everybody can use it. Boom, everybody's doing it. To think of the best thing as we can do is the one thing we can do for ourselves, and think that we need to isolate. We take all that information and starve people from the informative capacity of the informed, by the way, form again, information that we each have and learn. So helping isn't always helping when we're helping ourselves to the idea we're a big help, and we're actually contributing to the delinquency of another person who's thinking thoughts that are corrupt. And I think I've got to do for them what they're unwilling to do. If I let them become willing, all of a sudden they become a participant of capacity rather than another lag on the system. Today, we're offering lots and lots of money to people who aren't doing anything. It doesn't help them ultimately. It helps disenfranchise them and take away the nobility. Any nobility and potential they have becomes stripped because we think we need to fix it for them rather than let them do what they can do and start to step into that role. When people do what they can, they tend to do more of what they can naturally.
Do you think that's true? That
Well, I would say if somebody knew that they could do something, they would probably have a greater tendency of doing it than if they thought they couldn't. If they've done it, if you apply something and it works, it tends to be reapplied, just like if we apply something and it doesn't work, the reactive tendency is to constantly try to make it work. I would say that is a tendency developed with the idea that we know if something works, it can be used and utilized. We've just turned in a sick direction.
Yeah. You ever seen those orangutans like using scissors and stuff like that? Like
no.
the trainers like show them how to like use very simple tools just by one or two examples. And then the orangutan just grabs the utensil and uses it in the exact same way. Like,
yeah,
it's very, very interesting.
Well, it shows that learning is sort of inherent to survival. If we're adjusting and adapting to our environment, we're learning to interact with the environment as it's happening rather than thinking 3 months ago, it's a thought I had about it that was the failure. If I'm thinking always about the future and not thinking about the present, I'm going to find a future that is decayed, just like the present is decayed by not thinking about what I'm doing. And now I've created so many problems. I think the problems need to all be resolved rather than see that it's central to the thinking I'm doing about things that aren't happening that's causing that. That's what insanity is, basically imagining things that aren't happening is all that's happening. And to be worrying about things, I would suggest, is never worrying about what's happening, because if it was happening, we wouldn't be worried, we'd be acting. The car is going to run us over. We don't tend to stand in the street and wonder how it's going to go.
The deer in the headlights does.
Might freeze, yes. Yeah. But probably still curious what it is. I mean, they may be frozen by wondering, what is that? They don't quite realize it. They see the lights and not the car. But, I've watched plenty of squirrel run out into the street, see the car, run back, and then run right back under the wheels, under the pressure that's created by the stress of the situation. Do exactly the wrong thing. I mean, you see it in sports a lot. The best players, under the pressure of the game, of the series, of all that emotional stuff that goes along, that mental baggage that goes along, can make the exact wrong decision at the time that they're most needed.
Yeah.
But I would suggest if we were more actively engaged, we're already engaged with what's happening, but we're interpreting it as though our interpretation is all that's happening. If we were more engaged with an understanding that our interpretation is our interpretation, we would continue to be able to function with an interpretation, realizing it's just an interpretation, just like books on a shelf have all kinds of stories in them. It doesn't completely compel me to read them all and understand them before I act. I know they're there. I know it's something that's done. I know it's something I'm doing. All of a sudden, I can act with the story without any, just like think about drinking. I can think about it and say, oh, I know where that's going to go. I'm not going to do that. So I can continue to function on the basis of reality rather than get stuck in this loop of thinking. I need to think the thinking. I got to get the thinking right, which if I think I have to get the thinking right, I'm admitting I know it's wrong. And to spend more time on it is just to reinforce what's wrong, thinking it'll someday be right, rather than say, what's happening now is actually right. Everything that is happening right now is what is right, because it is happening. It doesn't have to be right in terms of what we think should be happening or what could be happening that might be better, but our chance to influence it is almost neutralized when we are preoccupied, not paying any attention and not expressing the potential we have to actually induce our sane response rather than induce a reactive response. And I would say we're sane by nature, and the reactivity of insanity is unnatural and unhealthy and illogical and unreasonable and irrational. It's all induced by thinking. Not all of it. I mean, there's some, genetically, genes are also adapting to the environment that they're experiencing. And if the environment I've been experiencing with my genes or exposing my genes to has been insane, my genes have been adapting, mutating in ways that are literally to what I would need. So they're creating inabilities in my system to try to deal with something that's completely irrational.
Here's one that'll bake your noodle. Do you think that chromosomes and genes adapt based on thinking experiences?
Well, think of stress. My genes are subjected to the stress in my body rather than the health. If my body is trying to deal, think of trying to talk sense to someone who's insane. Does it make any sane reason to think that if somebody's insane, they would ever think that you're sane? Right? So if our body is based in reality and truth and absolute knowing, it's actually being subjected to an experience of toxic chemicals and all kinds of things being released into my system through the stress and the pressure and the anxiety that I'm producing that it really doesn't know what to do with. So it comes up with options, just like organisms came up with options along the way. They're in an evolutionary phase. Things that don't work, what happens? They go extinct eventually, through at least the written record of animals and things. Animals that are dysfunctioning long enough don't last. They go. They're gone. However they developed, if they're maladaptive, they don't last. So I would say the genes, while they may be changing in my body, they aren't realized until I share them with another body. And we are the descendants of all of those thinkers from all of those other bodies who passed their genes on for us to inherit. Each one of us is coming from a lineage of millions of people over history. I think there's been 120 or 30 billion people to live through whatever recorded history is, something like that. It may be a little more, because I think there's been 120 billion deaths, which would mean you add the 8.5 billion we have today, and that would put it at 128 billion. But the point is, there's been a lot of people that have been subject to a lot of change in terms of the physical realm, the body, that have been passing those genes down. And we have more anxious disorders today. We have more allergies today. We have more diagnosis today. They seem to be growing and expanding, things that we used to not even identify, that we would just write people off. We gave words to that all of a sudden seemed to make sense because they seem to be real. And now we manage them as though they're reality rather than see they're a confluence and consequence of this condition, this mental condition, that we have no obligation to continue. Doesn't mean, I mean, I've known people, many people within sobriety who had all sorts of diagnoses that do not occur for them anymore. Things that are considered real. They don't take the medication, they don't need the medication, it's gone. While that insanity in thinking was there, it seemed like all of those diagnoses were absolutely correct, but it was induced by the thinking they were doing, that they were, when I make believe that I can oppose reality, I'm creating a division. Think of bipolar. Is that bipolarity? I'm trying to disconnect the positive and the negative, trying to think that there's one and not the other when they're intimately connected. Obsessive compulsive. I'm obsessive in my thinking, I'm going to be compulsive in my actions. And I would suggest that every obsessive thought we have has a compulsion attached to it in our experience. Why? Because it gives us perspective. Gives us a chance to either think it's something we have to stop at all costs and think of the effect of the problem, or start to track back and say, I must be thinking something obsessively, which means I'm maintaining a lie to be doing that thing. I'm getting information that's offering me perspective so I can see it clearly. And to think that what I need to do is feel better about that thing and get over it is to reinforce the idea that the thinking has nothing to do with it. So what happens? I keep doing it, I keep doing it, I keep doing it. Annual resolutions apparently need to be made annually because whatever's been resolved has been left unresolved.
Mm-hmm.
Just lingers.
But I guess you're right. When you say everything that is happening in this instance is the culmination and summation of all those previous instances, that this instance must also be then based on those previous thoughts and
everything,
previous modes of thinking of our ancestors and
well, and also the weather conditions and the Earth's, all of it.
Yeah, it's an ingredient. Everything. It's not the be all end all.
I mean, think of the way that the Northern Europeans have blonde hair. You know, they were in a very cold environment. I don't know why that would make that difference, but you don't see a lot of blondes in Africa unless they're albino, right? The weather had an impact on the way that people evolved and developed. And this isn't an argument for evolution, but my sense is if we recognize we're living in a process, that process is evolving, whatever it is, however it came about.
Yeah.
If change is change, there's a process. It is that synthetic process, a thesis, antithesis, synthesis, constantly combining. But in the combination is new recombinations and new recombinations. If to see that as present is to see that the newness of it has always also been present. And I've been mistaken it by thinking of it as past, thinking of it as future, rather than knowing the instability is in making believe the past and future have some place somewhere that isn't here now as the culmination of all that's happened and all that can happen. So if we have that freedom, then we can have anything happen collectively. It's just a choice. And to think of it in healthy terms, to think of it in terms where people start seeing that it's their thinking that they have control over. The one thing we were given control over is what we choose to think. Why? Because we're free to think what we want. That freedom is primarily based in what we think. And if we are condemned in any way, then it is the condemned thinking we're doing that's causing that impression, that effect. So to start thinking in those terms does not need to identify every instance that something happened 30 years ago to figure it all out, because we're constantly talking about figuring it out when there is nothing to figure out. It's already here. It's already completely explained in this moment. Always has been, always will be. And that reinforces the nature of an ever-present state. If it's always new, meaning it's always here, and everything that's here is always here, those things are very much the same in every present moment. So the absolute is revealed by seeing the sum total of it all, rather than the bits and pieces we tend to get stuck in and think of separate us and segregate us and distinguish us and create exceptions to the rule. And that, I would say, is an awakened contemplative meditation.
Yeah, that's a good one, Jack.
So if we're learning to meditate in the quiet when it's peaceful, if I listen to a Zen master who said, that isn't meditation. You're just experiencing the peace. He said, if you're sitting in the middle of traffic and you're meditating, that's meditation. And I had somewhat come to that conclusion because I would say, why is it whenever I go to a meeting, I feel great, I walk out, I feel like an idiot. Circumstance starts happening and I just feel like I'm overwhelmed by it all the time. Well, because I expect that peace happens to be peace of mind in my thinking, rather than see that the peace of mind is in fact my natural state. And how I think about it is what creates all those collisions. It's all the ideas I have that I'm not expecting something because I think that thought I'm having is reality. So what do I expect? Only what I think to happen. Well, that's a pretty narrow potential when everything that's possible is possible. That would mean even if I get what I want, it's never going to be satisfying. And I would say that's pretty consistent with obsessive and compulsive activities. Never enough. That's what addiction is. Never enough because I'm not thinking anything that has any basis. How can my thought be anything more than nothing? And I keep trying to fill it with more, and I'm adding to the numerator when the denominator is zero. There's nothing there. That fractured state of thinking is fractional thinking. But if the fractions don't have a denominator, they're not going to add up. The denominator only needs to be one for it to add up to anything. But if there's nothing in existence, if it's all fairy tale and all fantasy and all imagined reality, that's fantasy is reality. That's insanity. It isn't real. There isn't anything there. There's nothing there but a thought that it's real. So looking at it,
the only thing it needs to be is non-zero.
What's that?
The only thing it needs to be is non-zero.
Well, except that negative numbers don't actually exist in the universe. They're just a function of mathematics to help make sense out of this polarity. You can't have less of something in the universe because it's just matter that's transforming. So the energy field is all the same all the time. Which again points to the fact that we can't make more or less out of anything except in imagination. Things are as they are all the time, and they're intimately connected to everything as it is all the time. And there is no more or less of that in any given moment. And if a moment is infinitesimally small, that means it isn't in time or space, because there is no, if the newness of the moment is always new, there is no future. There is no past. It's always new. There's no continuum for it to be on. So it can't be in time. So we say there's no time like the present because there is no time in the present. It's absolutely the revelation of the absolute state of being. Always. Eckhart Tolle talks about this at length. I think he defines things that starts to give the physicality to it all, some sense of reality. It's very confusing, ultimately, or at least requires 8 or 10 books to be read rather than one, which I would say is probably good publishing. But again, it shows how we kind of come to conclusions that need other conclusions constantly. They need investigation. They're not simply stating that we're already there. We already have everything. We already know it. And now the question is, why don't we act like it? And I would say the answer is very simple. We're thinking about those things in ways that we think our thinking is those things. Rather than thinking about those things, thinking of those things, we think those things become what we think of those things and about those things. That's a major collision with those things. It's an inconsiderate, because it isn't considering them having any essence of their own, only what I think of them, when in fact we already share the same essence. So I'm not seeing them as any more than I limited to. And it's thoughtless because it isn't utilizing thought, it's utilizing ignorance as intellect. So thoughtlessness and inconsiderate is generally not something people like to say, you know what, I'm really thoughtless and I'm really good at being thoughtless and I'm really inconsiderate. You're going to love me. We don't tend to promote those things because we know we're ashamed of that. We're guilty for that. It's natural for us to be aware of that. And yet we haven't been talking about it broadly enough to actually say, oh, I do know that. Why would I try to hide those things if I didn't? Why would I always try to act thoughtful and overact thoughtful if I wasn't thinking in thoughtless terms? And I am not an exclusion to this because I talk about it more openly. I just decided to talk about it because I realized I was going crazy sitting on the thinking. I realized it wasn't helping me to be quiet about something that seemed to elicit such extraordinary reactions from other people that didn't like the confrontation. And so I was quiet for a long time, but I decided, what's the difference? What's the risk? There is none. There's no risk. People don't have to like it. They don't have to agree with me. They don't have to believe in it. I'm not here for that. I'm simply talking and sharing. And for those that listen and grow and interact, it confirms for me that we all know this. And we're using different words for it, but the essence of it is the spirit of it. And that's what we know. We absolutely know those things. So the comforting aspect is just simply eliminating and starting to dispel the rumors of the discomforting effects we create by the thoughts we have that have no place and aren't comfortable, because to maintain them creates discomfort because they have no place in space. They don't belong anywhere. They're literally insane ideas. We're intoxicated. And drug use today, alcoholism, suicide is an all-time high. I would think it might be time to talk about this from a point of cause rather than continue to focus on the effects and think we need to plow another few billion into trying to solve that problem when we're looking at the effect and not noticing that it's all effects are always sourced in a cause. The cause always precedes the effect. They're instantaneous, but the effect doesn't occur without a cause. They treat the effect as to do exactly what we're doing in our thinking by thinking our thinking is real and reality no longer exists. We're reversing the order of reality, the law and order of nature. It's impossible. We can think it, but all of the byproducts of it show us something's wrong. And the heartbeat goes on.
Yeah, no, good stuff.
So if there's an adventure here and an awe-inspired potential of the moment, which is already here, and the potential of it is to think it's here, the difference between choice on the basis of desperation and inspiration is that the inspiration is fully aware that everything is just a choice and it can be rechosen and unchosen, and we can think again, and all that possibility is there because we're always in the face of that. And that's invigorating, I would say, and vitality. It's ultimately not releasing adrenaline into our system and all kinds of other antitoxins trying to fight an emergency that doesn't exist. And we'll start producing all of the things that we thought we were running low on because we're not taxing the system with things that aren't happening. To your point earlier, do I think the DNA is affected? If our own bodily chemistry can be affected and we can deplete adrenaline from our system because we're in an imagined emergency all the time, certainly we're having an impact on not only our DNA and the structure of our own capacity, our genetic structure to procreate in ways that are healthy, we're having an effect on everything and everyone everywhere else. If everything that's happening is happening now, we are affecting it all. We're making a difference to it all. We're changing it all. And we just don't think we are because we're ashamed of the results. Just the same way I want to hide my own defects and think I'm not, when I realized that guilty wasn't a feeling, it was actually a conviction. I was actually convicting myself for being guilty for the things I was doing and was ashamed to admit, because guilt and shame tend to be side by side. Neither of them are feelings. They're awarenesses of conditions created from being guilty for what we're ashamed of. And to be ashamed of it is a pretty good indication we know something's wrong that we're doing that we think is right. So I really appreciate your investigative willingness, your growth, your standing into this conversation and exploring it and looking at the things that you bring back to me. It really confirms for me that this is something we share. And I don't always get that. I often wonder what I am doing wrong about this process. And I know that I can be very insistent. I know that I can be very dogged. I know that I can be very consistent with the repetition of some of these points. And I'm probably not I probably have some things to learn in that regard, no doubt. But I'm doing what I can with the understanding that it may not be liked and may not be embraced. And yet when it is, it seems to create that sense that when two or more are gathered, there seems to be something that goes on between us where an awareness is greater than the thinking we were doing about the two or three together.
Right.
There's just a greater sense of knowing. So I appreciate that. And I've narrowed the conversation down, as you've known, because I think I've been trying to just let it have its own course, but that course is so endemic to the way that we function in society and have so many insane ideas floating around and seem to get stuck in them, and that I don't want to reinforce that if it's possible to talk about it and talk about the more expansive view of the sanity that we naturally share and begin to allow people to experience it from that point of view rather than simply witness the I think we witness enough of it during the day to begin to pinpoint what's going on around us when we can feel the tension and the insistence and the demands and including our own, because I don't think we notice it if we're not doing it. I don't think it's obvious to us, and we wouldn't feel the sting of it if that sting weren't the thing we were doing too. But to start to see that again is to start to see, oh, everything that's happening is actually the curriculum of life's terms. And I'm in a college classroom deciding whether or not I want to actually listen to the lesson today or not listen. And I can make that choice. But I'm going to suffer the consequences of not making it or begin to develop the method of operating in behalf of it very quickly, because it's natural to do that and it's unnatural to do the other. The other takes constant grind and pressure and reactiveness and seeming confidence and ambition. And in the direction of sanity, which isn't even a direction, it's just beginning to notice that that state is the essence of reality. It's the undoing of all those other things that makes the difference between starting to be aware of that absolute potential. And it doesn't mean not seeing things that are disturbing, because I started seeing how deeply disturbed I was when I started thinking of this in more accurate terms. I became more compassionate because I started to see my own experience as a very sick thing to be doing. Not something I had to stop, but something I was simply doing, and I started living with that. And I started to melt, literally cried more than I'd ever cried, and started to feel things witness things that other people were going through, and actually had that emotional connection, seeing that I desensitized and segregated and diminished and distinguished my experience from everyone else, because I was trying to keep it to myself because it was so alone. There was no basis to it.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you, my friend.
No, I appreciate you, Jack, as always. So,
and let's continue. And any questions from out there, from anyone, there's an email. You're certainly welcome to ask. I would appreciate any kind of thoughts. And those thoughts absolutely feed into the potential for this discussion to both grow and be valuable to anyone listening. And so we do this on that note of service that I learned to do within AA, but I want to do service to the service we're doing by start actually serving the ideas, not of how to get over and get better, feel better about things, but actually start to dissolve the things we're doing collectively to start to see that that absolute state of knowing is in fact something that we all have, and can start doing things that would seem to be unimaginable to the thinking that we might currently maintain. So
Yes.
that is my seemingly parting comment, and I love you, Gabe. You've
Love
been a
you too.
great asset to my process. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Bye bye.